may not be suitable for all audiences.
He's in tune.
Art 101 with Mr. Burgher.
Scholars, welcome back to Art 101 with me, Mr. Burgher. I'm a professional artist and master educator. I try to provide you with the best in art historical content. Please interact with it. Thank you.
Out there I was somebody.
One of the great impressionist painters that is oftentimes overlooked is Berthe Morisot. Today, as you know, because you clicked on the video, we're going to dive into the 101 in her story, so let's jump right on in. One of the great impressionist painters of her time was Berthe Morisot, or as they would say in French, Berthe Morisot, but I'm not French, so I mispronounce it. But leave your comments down below if you really are that inclined to, as some of you are, but at any rate. Morisot was 23 years old when she first exhibited at the Paris Salon, that annual French government-sponsored show that really was known for catapulting artists into superstardom, and Morisot would definitely not be an exception to that rule. Being a powerhouse of art, she would appear in the Salon 6 times before joining up with the Impressionists in that first exhibition, along with others that included Paul Cézanne, Claude Monet, Camille Pissarro, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and some 30 others. Growing up, she had private art lessons. Being a bourgeoisie class citizen, Morisot was able to have some private art lessons along with her sisters. This began under the tutelage of Geoffrey-Alphonse Cochrane, who gave direction primarily in the basics of drawing, and then that went on to Joseph Gouchard, also provided some training in the area of drawing, as well as introducing them to the Louvre collection, where they began creating paintings of copies starting in 1858. This was a time when females were not really allowed to have a formal training in art, but more of a at-home sort of exposure to art training. But their parents were very eager to back up their interests, and they built a studio where they could be privately tutored. And Morisot, along with her sister Etma, took art making a little bit more seriously. Her oldest sister Yves was not quite as interested in it. Morisot wanted to be treated fairly, and she learned from an early age that men and women just simply didn't have the same role in society or in the art space. Even though she disagreed with it, this was her reality. She once even said, "I don't think that there's ever been a man who treated a woman as an equal, and that's all I've asked for I know that I'm worth as much as they." Around the time that she was working at the Louvre and becoming more acquainted with folks that were there and made friends that were also studying at the Louvre, like Edouard Manet and Claude Monet, she would become under the direction of Camille Corot beginning in 1861, who very much exposed her to the outdoor painting approach and the use of watercolors with those techniques. And this is her first exposure to painting outside, because women were not allowed to go outside and paint without some form of supervision, and so this is really her first exposure due to the landscape background of her teacher. And right around this time, she would be becoming more and more considered a professional artist, beginning that distinction around 1858. She would also be trained by Ashley Oudinot beginning in 1863 and the sculptor Aimé Millet from 1863 to 1864, although none of those sculptures that she created have survived. Side note, Berthe Morisot was very much influenced by Edouard Manet, who really helped her evolve in her style. She participated in his paintings as a model, but also gave him advice as well. It is said that 3 of her paintings hung in his bedroom, although some people speculate on the intimacy of their relationship. Morisot actually married his brother Eugene Manet in 1874.
Love. I can't think of anything more disgusting.
Because of the regulations that she had to abide by in order to paint outside, it was quite frankly a whole lot easier for her to stay inside and paint. Now that's not to say that Morisot did not create landscape paintings. She did. We see that. But from a practical perspective, it was a whole lot easier to stay inside with a model, and that's what she did. She predominantly painted women inside from an unobjectified perspective. A lot of the painters that were doing this, as we look back, were doing things like this. They're showing women as objects, showing women in these voyeuristic sorts of perversions, where Morisot, like this, is showing women doing what they really did from a true perspective, having that insider perspective of what women did because she was one. And this very much went against the common practice because the common practice wasn't from the female perspective, it was from the male one. As mentioned, she was in her first salon show in 1864. She would become a regular in the salon until 1867 when she began to show with the Impressionists, and she would continue that practice until the very end of those Expressionist art exhibitions. Side note, Berthe Morisot and Camille Pissarro are the only two artists to participate in all 8 of the Impressionist exhibitions. Now, this is news, because most people, most historians, say that Pissarro was the only one, but he wasn't. Throughout the show history, artists participating in the shows and the artists that are listed in the catalog do not align. During the 1879 show, her daughter was born just before that, in November of 1878. And she was not included in the catalog because they didn't know she was going to have work in the show. However, in correspondence from Claude Monet, he mentions that he enjoyed the artwork that she had put in that show of the 4th Impressionist exhibition of 1879.
But he's gonna get nowhere with that.
No, he ain't, is it?
No, he ain't.
Early in her career, Berthe Morisot worked predominantly in paint media. She preferred watercolor to oil, but also began to experiment in pastel in 1875-ish due to the influence of Edgar Degas. As I mentioned previously, her professional work really began around 1858. But a lot of those early works no longer exist. She destroyed much of her work before 1869. That's about 11 years worth of work that she just wasn't 100% satisfied with, and so instead of it going out into the public, she destroyed it. And I know what that's like. I've done that myself. In the mid-1880s, she began to draw with a more dominant focus in her works. She began to put more pastel, more charcoal, and more colored pencil into her works than she'd ever done before. And this was kind of a counter-motivation to what her fellow Impressionists were doing around that time. You see, the Impressionists were trying to blur the forms and make things a little more foggy, where she really wanted to clarify forms and lines, and so by using these drawing media, she could really sharpen the image. And her works are pretty small, so having a really sharp, small image to her was much more effective than having a big blurry one. This may also be due to her influence by photography and Japanism, which is the influence of Japanese art and design on primarily French artists of this time. And one of the other side effects of her friendship with Edouard Manet was her use of unprimed canvases. So instead of doing this underpainting and build up, she would just start with that raw canvas and start to work. And that work began with solid drawings. Again, a little bit different approach than many of her Impressionist counterparts.
Consider me neutral.
It takes more than just being in a show or exhibition to make you a productive artist. It takes a lot of other things going on in your favor. In 1872, Berthe Morisot was able to make connections with Paul Durand-Ruel, the art dealer of the Impressionists, who would buy 22 of her canvases. That gives some financial stability. In 1874, as mentioned, she had married Eugene Manet, a man that became a stay-at-home father not only to support her ambitions, but also to care for their young daughter, Julie, her only child. Fast forward a few years, Eugene had suffered from an unknown illness and would pass away in April of 1892. Just 3 years later, Julie would get pneumonia and pass that illness on to her mother, who was taking care of her. This pneumonia is what would cause Morisot to pass away, and their young daughter was orphaned at the age of 16. Side note, there are no questions it takes a village to care for a child, especially in the case of Julie Manet. Both of her parents had died by the time she was 16, and her mother had put her in the guardianship of the French poet Stéphane Mallarmé. She was allowed to stay with family members and cousins and things, and very much supported by her parents' good friend and colleague, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, as she would grow into a painter, model, and art collector in her own regards.
You're an artist?
I try.
Berthe Morisot was a co-founder of Impressionism, who would very much influence generations to follow. She was unwilling to disturb the decor of her family home, so she chose to work out of a closet. Although, in a very gender-defying moment of the time, she had a husband who worked as a stay-at-home father. So there are gender norms met, and there are gender norms destroyed. Regardless of how you slice it, there are 850 known works, and in her lifetime, she only sold about 30. And she is one of the marquee artists of Impressionism. So I think sometimes our standard of what a productive professional artist is very much distorted by time and history and productivity. Hopefully this gives you some insights to the artist that Morisot was, and hopefully feeds that ambition for the artist that you want to become, as well as the legacy that you want to leave behind.
Scholars, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I love being able to bring it to you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. You have a good day.
He's gone. He's